Welcome back to this video series where we're exploring integrative person-centred counselling. Today we're going to think about defence mechanisms, and these were introduced in the last video where we talked about psychoanalysis. Last week we introduced Freud's model of the mind, which is the id, ego and superego. So when we need something that we judge as bad or negative, then the ego has to try and manage this conflict between the unconscious parts of the self. And these manifest as symptoms. Now, what Freud showed, and later, Anna Freud, his daughter, and other theorists like Melanie Klein, is that in order to manage this inner conflict, people develop defense mechanisms. And those mechanisms are protective. They're not dysfunctional. They actually help the person to function with this conflict in mind. That is to say, if you think about one of the defenses, one of the most common is repression, which is a need comes up in the body and that need gets pushed down. Now, if I'm sat here talking to you and I fancy drinking from my cup of tea, for example, that need might be, important to push down so that I don't interrupt the conversation as it's happening. Now, if I come from a childhood where my need for comfort, my need for proximity to a caregiver was not just momentarily paused, but systematically abused or traumatizing or something that was quite hostile, then each time this feeling comes up in me of wanting to connect to another person, that enormous feeling, that hostile response will kick in, and that will force me to repress the need, to push that need back. And typically what happens then, I go through the world experiencing on some level that need, that need is still there to connect to people, but I have to push it back. And the defense mechanisms comes out in many ways. One of the ways is to simply deny that experience as if it never happened. I might just say, I don't need anybody in my life. Another way is to do what Freud called the reaction formation, which is to take on the opposite of that feeling as a way of defending against the fear of rejection for it. And this is typical with children in the playground, where sort of a boy might hit a girl, let's say, instead of asking her out. This need of wanting to connect gets brought out in hostile behavior because the child cannot face their own want to be in a romantic relationship. Now, that's very normal, and it's very useful that as we grow up, we don't always show our needs, because sometimes our needs are unrealistic or they may need to be attended to at a later point. But again, children that get responses from caregivers that are actively against those needs will develop defense mechanisms that come to define their whole personality. So a defense mechanism is an unconscious process that causes us to turn away from our needs, and it's also governed by the judgment center, the superego, on an unconscious level. That is to say that if I'm working with a client who is clearly coming for therapy and consenting to that, but every time I ask them, how are you doing, how are you, or something straightforward, they respond by changing the subject, by acting as if my question was stupid or somehow baffling to them. I've had clients say things like, well, I'm in therapy, how do you think I'm doing? Where I'm just trying to be, in a person-centered way, empathic. What you're met with is a number of responses that counter the way that you're trying to work. And I think a pure person-centered counsellor can overcome this just simply by being present. And in a way, I'm not trying in this series to say we have to take on other ideas. But in my own practice, I find it quite limiting using empathy and understanding alone, because a lot of the unconscious tricks of the mind can draw me into repeated patterns where I feel I'm circling around and around and around, and getting off that carousel is possible when I think more from a psychodynamic or a defense mechanism perspective. So let's take an example from the book. Do a bit of story time. So just a reminder, the book is Integrative Person-Centred Counselling, not that I'm trying to sell more copies. And I'm working with a client here. I say, she's just separated from her mother to go to university. And I say to her, how is it to separate from your mother in the first week at university? She says, we're kind of just keeping it very platonic in a way. I don't know if I'm using this word right. Like, I acknowledge she's my mum, but it ends there. I say, you acknowledge she's your mum, but... She says, but I'm keeping it very normal, at a very normal point. I'm not doing anything about it. I say, how is that for you? And she says, I don't mind too much, to be honest. I have my little support system. And I might even be flying to Spain soon. Yeah, because tickets in this season are very cheap. It's literally cheaper to fly to Spain than to go to Northampton. Now, for a client who has experienced other people as caring about their needs, when I ask, how is that for you? They would typically tell me, just how it is. Even if they were feeling comfortable, they would at least express the feeling. And what this client does is says, I don't mind too much, to be honest. And those two phrases, I don't mind too much, to be honest. It's a really sort of emphatic denial that there's a minding, that there's something that the client is minding there. And then the change of subject, I might be flying to Spain soon and going off in that direction, suggests that at work here is some self-preservation, a protection from my question. Now, with this particular client, I show in the book, and she's allowed me to use the videos in lectures, so I show the clips from her therapy. And what happens is, each time I try to empathize, we end up in the same pattern. So I leave space for a feeling, for an experience, and we go off in this direction. And I follow this direction and come back to a feeling, and then we keep moving away. What the defense mechanism concept is saying here is that forget about the content for a moment. We're not really talking about flying to Spain. We're not really talking about university. We're talking about this unconscious experience of separation. And once you get that that's what you're really talking about, the client trying to separate symbolically from the feeling gives you very important information. And what it did for me was to say, not that I'm going to interpret that to the client. I'm not going to say something like, do you think you're avoiding separation, similar to how you avoided separation from your mother at an earlier time, which is factually accurate in her history. Instead, I'm going to acknowledge that the direction that she leads me in is one that's away from where she really wants to be. And that is to experience the separation in a safe environment. So the idea of the defense mechanism, of this case, displacement and denial, gives me a way of working with this person that helps me to understand empathically what they're really feeling. And what they're really feeling is anxiety, a real horror at the idea of separation, so much so that it can't even be felt or experienced. Every time I try and feel it, the client comes back with something completely different. Let me just read another example. I say to the client, when you say the word lonely, there seems to be a feeling there. And she says, acknowledges it is a feeling. It's like a sulking emotion because I have everything in Northampton and now I'm here and it's all so different. I guess I'm missing it in a way. And I say, missing? What are you missing? And she says, it's kind of like the friends I have, I guess, and my cat. He's too cute not to miss. My friends actually went to my house today without me being there. They only went for the cat because he's so cute. If you saw him, you'd be in love. Even if you're not a cat person, every person that's not a cat person will tell me they don't like cats. Then they'll meet my cat and they'll be like, never mind. And then she laughs. Now, in a way, this is quite funny, that she's telling a story about her cat and she's really, she is a very funny person. But if you're psychodynamic in your thinking here, it's really sad what's happening, which is she cannot experience the loneliness. She cannot experience missing her friends, missing her cat in full detail because it's just not safe enough. And while at the surface I do want to follow where she leads me, and over time hope that and expect almost that she will be able to tolerate these difficult emotions, the psychodynamic idea here anchors me to that moment and sees beneath these words that symbolically we're still working on the same issue. The same process here is about separation, and the client is just really deeply struggling to tolerate that. David Marlon put this into a very helpful triangle. He called it the triangle of conflict, and it's a way of thinking about what's happening with clients like this when they're unable to connect emotionally with their experiences. At the base of the triangle is the feeling, the hidden feeling. In this case, it might be a feeling of loss, a feeling of separation. What then happens as we go up the triangle is that anxiety kicks in. Because separation has always been experienced by this client as harsh, horrible, unresolvable, she ends up associating any separation, and that can be even ending the therapy session that day. It can be replying to a text message. All of these kind of symbolic ways of separating from other people throw up anxiety for her. And this anxiety kicks in and is immediately covered by a defense mechanism. What Marlon is saying is that in order to help the client to overcome these defense mechanisms, first we need to anchor ourselves before the anxiety kicks in the hidden feeling, and to know that the client is unconsciously leading us to that hidden feeling by virtue of the repeated circling process. And I think this is very congruent with a person-centered approach, though it's not a traditional way of looking at things. Traditionally, we think that being client-centered is being present in what they're bringing here and now, rather than looking at patterns and circling back ourselves. But with this client in the session, and you can see it in the video, she is out of touch with her feelings. You heard her say it herself. I don't mind, to be honest. I don't mind, I feel okay. But then later in the session, she gets really deeply emotional. She starts to cry at missing her friends, missing people back in her hometown. And this is directly as a result of the fact that I kept bringing back the theme of separation. So the only thing I've done in my practice here is I've realized that this theme comes up again and again, and that it's covered over by a defense mechanism. And I see the importance of me being led by that unconscious process to re-raise it with the client until she starts to make contact with it. And when she does that, it's very clear she can be congruent with her emotions. She can be upset in this case. But I think without that, we really struggle, and we end up providing sometimes a bit of an empty therapeutic experience. And we have lots of clients who we see who say that, don't they? They say, I've seen therapists for years, and it was just like talk. It was just like conversation. So my advice to any person-centered therapist is not necessarily to think of themselves as psychodynamic practitioners, but just to take those ideas into the practice, spot when the client is repressing or denying an emotion, or seems to be showing the opposite emotion to what they really are communicating, or when they treat you, like you are bad or hostile or somebody that you really don't connect with. This might lead you to certain conclusions about the unconscious life of the client. And I think for me that's really enriching in my practice. So I think I'll leave it there for today's video, and just see you in the next one. We're going to move in a completely different direction, looking at jungian psychology, which developed from Freud and beyond. But for now, hopefully that's been a useful introduction to defense mechanisms. Thanks very much.